My name is Diane Brigand. I'm a Sister of St. Agnes from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and I'm also a professor of Old Testament theology at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I'd like to share with you some reflections on biblical stories that are referred to in the Holy Father's document, Misericordia Vultus. That document in English, or the title in English, is The Face of Mercy. In the very first sentences of that document, the Holy Father writes, Jesus is the face of the mercy of God. And so the document presents us or offers us a couple of stories from the New Testament about how Jesus is the face of the mercy of God. But to understand that, we have to understand what the Old Testament means when it talks about the mercy of God. The mercy of God is not simply the forgiveness of God. It is a religious attitude. The word in Hebrew for mercy comes from the word for womb. So a way that I frequently translate rachamim, that word, because we have so many definitions for the word of mercy, I call it womb love or womb attachment. It refers to, and it's a beautiful image, about the relationship between the woman and the child in her womb. There is an intimate relationship, so intimate that sometimes you don't know if the child is a part of the woman because the child grows from the woman, therefore is a part of the woman, or the child is separate from the woman, and the child is only really separate from the woman at birth. So that means that in a very real sense, there is this intimate relationship of God with the creation that God brings forth. Beautiful, and we use that language, that God brings forth, which is a feminine or a birth image. So the mercy of God is the sentiment, the profound relationship, whether you want to call it love or what, but it is the relationship that God has for the creation that God brings forth. And it is from that relationship that God forgives. Forgiveness is not the relationship. Forgiveness is a fruit of the relationship. And justice, this does not erase the notion and the need for justice. So mercy does not erase justice. Mercy produces justice. So justice comes from mercy, not simply from vengeance, not simply from retaliation. Justice comes from mercy. It must be restorative, not simply retributive. So that image is found in the Old Testament in many places. The primary place it is found in Exodus 34, verse 6. And it is the attitude that God has toward the people who have just worshiped the golden calf. So rather than strike them dead, God says, I am merciful. I am slow to anger. I am filled with love, steadfast love. And you can depend upon this. It will not change. So that's the understanding of mercy. It is the fundamental relationship that God has. It's womb love. We get into the New Testament because we're talking about Jesus as the face of the mercy of God. That would mean that in a certain sense, in a very profound sense, Jesus is the face of this womb love, of this relationship that God has, very intimate relationship with the fruit of the divine womb. So we find passages where, again, a special word is used. Just as this womb love in the Old Testament is only referring to the love of God. Every time it appears, it is referring to the love that God has for us, not for the love that we have for God, or the merciful. Even though the word is used, it's not the same Hebrew word. There are other words that are also translated mercy or compassion, but this word means the attachment of God for us. So in the Greek, we're in another language, so as anybody who knows two languages, there's not ever exact translation. It's a kind of more or less close translation. So there's a Greek word. It doesn't mean womb, but it means an interior movement, which of course womb love is, an interior movement. But it's not primarily a feminine image meaning womb, but it is interior movement. But it's always, once again, only used in relationship to God's love for us, God's compassion for us. So the meaning is the same, even though the word does not contain the feminine image. So there are a couple of stories, only a couple of stories, and it's always God that has it. And of course, the stories are stories about human beings. But when you read the story, you realize it's really a story about God's love for us. One story is the story of the prodigal father, because I think the story is really a story of the father, not the son. And when the father sees the son coming back, the son hasn't done anything except come back. So in his mind, he's not yet forgiven by his father. He doesn't know if his father is even going to forgive him. But the father is filled with this womb love, right? Which is really this, this interior attitude. And out of that comes the forgiveness. So the father is the one who has this attitude. That's one story where the word is found. Another story where the word is found is the story of, we refer to it frequently as the unforgiving servant. It's the story where a servant owes his master a tremendous amount of money, and he comes to the master and he asks for time to be able to work and pay it off. He does not ask for the debt to be forgiven, as we say. He asks for time. And the master is so compassionate. He is filled with compassion. There's that word, splanchnon in Greek. He is filled with compassion, and he forgives the debt. But then the servant goes out, and another servant owes him a much smaller sum of money and asks for the same thing. Give me time to work it off. And the servant who has received this forgiveness, out of the interior compassion of God, of the master, refuses. And so the master then says, because I have acted toward you in a certain way, and you have not acted to your fellow servant in the same way. And he says, throw him into prison. Punish him because he has not been merciful. So the focus is not on the punishment, and nor is it on the debt. The focus is on that interior dimension of compassion. But in this story, the servant is us. The master is probably God. And so a way of saying this, though what I'm going to say now, this particular injunction is not found in this story, it is found someplace else. Be compassionate as your Heavenly Father has compassionate. In this story, it would be compassionate toward your fellow servants, toward other people in the world, as God has been compassionate to you. Now, the third story is another story of compassion, but it is the story of the Good Samaritan. The story of the Good Samaritan is told by Jesus in response to something that precedes that story. We find this story in Luke's Gospel. If I could just read a couple of verses. There was a scholar of the law. Sometimes it's called the scribe, but a scribe is a scholar of the law. And a scholar of the law is really a scholar of the religious tradition, because Torah is not just laws. And in the Jewish tradition, the law is also the tradition. One would say a biblical theologian. So there was a scholar of the law who stood up to test him. Somebody wanted to trap Jesus. So this is not one looking seriously for an answer to the question that he will ask. Teacher, what must I do to inherit an eternal life? And Jesus says, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And the man said, You shall love the law, or Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength. That is taken from Deuteronomy. And then he says, in reply, he also answers, you have judged correctly. Do this and you will live. So the theologian is asking, what must I do? And then he says, who's my neighbor? That's the question. So all of this is to understand, who is my neighbor? Who am I to love? But the issue is, who's my neighbor? And in answer to that, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. We know the story. Somebody comes down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he is beaten up, and he's left on the side of the road to die. And along comes a priest by definition, somebody who ministers in the temple. Now, in the tradition of Israel, you minister in the temple. Every tribe has a right to minister in the temple 1 month a year. It might explain why there are 12 tribes. So the people take turns ministering. Now, if it's identified as a priest, chances are, though the text doesn't say that, he's concerned about his preparation for ministering in the temple. Now, what does that mean? He must be ritually clean, ritually pure. It's not a moral issue. It is an issue of being as fit as you can be to minister in the temple. That's what ritual purity means. That means that, in a certain sense, you have to be a perfect example of a human being. You have to have all your parts, and they have to all work. All human fluids have got to stay in the body, except with elimination, because that's natural. But human fluids must stay in the body. If you have any issue of blood, you are ritually unclean, because the blood is to stay in the body. That's why women are seldom able to worship in the temple, because every month they are ritually unclean.
In life, we are not alone. We live with and among people. We constantly enter into contact and relationship with others. Some of these relationships are very formal and superficial, but some are very deep and intimate. How do relationships work? We can all easily relate with those relationships that have been wounded, which are sometimes even bleeding. Father Martin Padovani, SVD, has written a book called Healing Wounded Relationships. It is the result of his many years of work as a marriage counselor. He deals with some of the very simple but pertinent topics like communications, listening, intimacy, forgiveness, reconciliation, and dealing with anxiety and fear. And of course, a very practical question: how do you make a marriage work? You will surely be enriched by this book. You should get it for yourself, or maybe get a copy for a relative or a friend. Be blessed by this book and improve your relationships.
Call the number on the screen or email us to get your copy. You can also place your order by visiting our website. Do it today.
Another way that you can become unclean is to touch a dead body, because a dead body is death. Now, here is the priest, and there's a man on the side of the road. He is in a terrible fix. If the man needs help, well, I shouldn't even say that. As a Jew, not as a priest, but as an Israelite, as a Jew, you have a serious responsibility to take care of that man and give him what he needs. But you don't know if he's alive. So you don't know if you can be faithful to that responsibility. Because if he's dead, you will be ritually unclean. So what's he going to do? The story says he will not risk ritual impurity. So he walks by and doesn't see him. In other words, he does not put himself at risk for the sake of another. Keep that in mind. That's not uncommon. So he walks by. So the next one coming by is a Levite. Same situation, because a Levite functions in the temple. A different function, but functions in the temple. One could say it's similar, but not exactly the same. A priest and a deacon. Here's a priest and a Levite. He's in the same fix. Should I go and help him? But what if he's dead? I will be ritually unclean. So he walks by and doesn't see him. Comes a Samaritan. Now, he does not have the same problem, because Samaritans are considered unclean simply by being Samaritans, because their ancestors intermarried with Syrians when Israel was taken to Babylon. Not everybody went. The Samaritans who lived in the north intermarried with Assyrians who came in and settled. So they are considered impure. They're mixed blood, so they are impure. They are ritually unclean. So he's not in that fix. But he has a different situation. He is a Samaritan, which means he's marginal. He's discriminated against. The Jews hate Samaritans. So from his point of view, why should I bother with him? He is my cultural enemy. He might even be a physical enemy. Why should I bother? Why should I care about people who have thrown me to the side of the road? So he has a different issue, but he has the same reason. Why? The question is, why should I care for him? And he did. He went over, took care of the man. If the man was dead, he probably would have taken care of the body. Not simply because the dead body on the side of the road is a physical danger, but because it's a human being, or was a human being. And having respect for another human being, regardless of his ethnic diversity, regardless of the fact that they didn't belong to the same religion, though Samaritans thought they did worship the same God, they were not allowed to worship in the temple. Despite that, he went and took care of him. And he was the marginal man. He not only took care of him, he took him to an inn and said, take care of him, because I have a business trip. And when I come back, if I owe you anything, I will pay. This is a man who went beyond responsibility. He saw a human being in need, and he did everything he could. And then Jesus asks the question. This story is supposed to answer the question, who is my neighbor? But Jesus asks a different question, or asks a question that will give a different answer. He does not say who your neighbor is. He asks the question, who has acted like a neighbor? So the issue is not, who should I take care of? The issue is, who's the one who takes care of people? And the answer to that is, the one pushed to the side of the road, the Samaritan who was marginal, the Samaritan who did not worship as we worshiped, the Samaritan who was of a different ethnic background. That's the one who acted like a neighbor. That's the one not only who received love, because that's not the question asked, and that there's no indication that the Samaritan received love, because the question was, who am I supposed to love? The answer is, who's the one that gave love to his enemy, if you will? So, what has this got to do with mercy? The word is there. Splanknan is there. So why did the Samaritan act like a neighbor? Why did the Samaritan bother with somebody? He knew that man was the enemy of his own people. He knew this. He knew this was a needy man because he knew it as a Jew, or presumed it was a Jew because he was in the land of the Jews. Right? He was the one who acted like a neighbor. He was the one, the text said, when he saw the man, was filled with compassion, overcome by compassion. The word is there. So in a sense, is this story showing the compassion of God? Yes, probably, because the word refers to the attitude that God has to people. But remember what this story is about when it is part of Pope Francis's document that speaks about Jesus as the face of the mercy of God. Remember also the other story of the unforgiving servant. The master was compassionate and said to the servant, because you were not compassionate, you will be punished. I will not give you the favor you asked for, or who you didn't ask for. I will not show you my kind of compassion. This is a story about how we are to show compassion. The story of the prodigal father shows the compassion of God. The story of the unforgiving servant shows that we must be compassionate as God was compassionate. So this is a story showing that we must be compassionate as God is compassionate. Now, there are other details in this story as well. The details are we must be compassionate not simply to the people of our household, not simply to the people of our social group, not simply to the people who worship God as we worship God, believe in God as we believe in God. That is not an issue. The Good Samaritan did not go to the man and say, what church do you belong to? Who did you vote for? What's your political party? Which gym do you belong to? Do you even belong to a gym? Where'd your family come from? None of those questions were asked. So he was compassionate to another human being. No questions asked. He didn't ask for his passport. So in a very real sense, the compassion that we are called to show is a compassion to another human being. Not simply to the human beings that we separate as us, our group, our buddies, our sisters, a human being. That's where we are joined to each other fundamentally, as being human beings, not primarily as being of the same family. We are to be compassionate to another human being. Now, I think, and those are the three places, fundamental places, where that word is used as Jesus teaches us. So in a certain sense, it's not who is my neighbor, who am I forced to live or love or be with? No questions about the who. The who. So in a certain sense, the story does answer the primary question, but indirectly. The primary question, who is my neighbor? The answer is everyone. Now that's an important question, because probably at the time of Jesus, certainly at the time of early Israel, the neighbor was the people who belonged to your clan or your tribe, and everyone else was a threat. Everyone else was considered an enemy, because frequently they were, but everyone else. It's a very interesting story in the story of Abraham. Abraham was in his tent, which says something about, a desert dweller. And three men come up to him. Now, there's a whole question about who these men were, but it's very clear their actions. They come up to him. Now, the question in desert hospitality, it's a question of hospitality. And hospitality does not simply mean come over to our place for supper. Hospitality means I open my door to you as I would open my door to anyone with whom I am associated. But that's very dangerous, because this might be an enemy. So the protocol of hospitality is, a stranger comes, and this is dangerous to the householder, because this could be an enemy. It's also dangerous to the stranger, because the householder might kill him, seeing him as an enemy. So how do you do that? He does not say, I'm safe, I'm not an enemy. No, the householder, in a certain sense, makes sure that he can't be an enemy by inviting him in. Now that's dangerous for the householder because it could be an enemy, but it's also dangerous for the journeyer, the traveler, to be invited into somebody's home because he could be killed. But he comes in. It's always dangerous. So how can this man who is the journeyer or the traveler be assured you're safe? The householder offers him a meal, showing you're safe. Okay? But you're not really sure. You know, this could be a trap. There's always the danger on both sides. Ancient hospitality, desert hospitality, is always dangerous. So you have to do this dance. And you give him the best you have. All right? And that's a way of showing, neutralizing the danger. So what we have here with the Samaritan is also a way of hospitality. There's no dance here. It's simply open-ended hospitality, openness. So when an ancient Jew would say, who's my family? It's the people that I know because they are of my family, the people of my tribe because they are my tribe, the people of my clan, but not outsiders. They're always dangerous. So who's my enemy? Somebody close to you. I mean, who's my neighbor? Somebody close to you. So this story asks, who's my neighbor? And what does the story say? Your neighbor is the outsider. Your neighbor is not the insider. Your neighbor is not one who's part of your religious group, like a priest or a Levite. Your neighbor is anybody who needs help. So by telling this story, in a certain sense, Jesus changes the question by asking another question. But he does answer that question with the story. But he also adds something else. Not only, who's my neighbor? The outsider. He asks the question, who is acting like a neighbor? The outsider. The outsider is my neighbor that I have to love, but the outsider is also the neighbor is also the outsider who shows love. Talk about inclusivity. And why does either the Good Samaritan or, why does the Good Samaritan show that? Because as the text says, he is filled with this mercy. We must be merciful as our Heavenly Father is merciful.